Halo's entire alien hierarchy was built on a debt nobody agreed to owe. The precursors seeded the galaxy billions of years ago. They built the Forerunners as assistants, then chose humanity as the true heir. The Forerunners claimed the mantle anyway, and were later judged unworthy, while some surviving precursors lived on as dust tied to the Flood. That's why today I'm breaking down all 12 major species in Halo and what each one's place in that legacy actually costs. Starting with the civilization that picked its own heir before anyone got a say. Precursors. Halopedia's Precursors page draws on a substantial list of sources, and only limited first-person testimony survives from beings identified with them. Rude, considering they made everyone else's ancestors. That gap is the whole problem with this story. The civilization responsible for seeding numerous worlds and shaping many sentient species left only a limited record in its own voice. Much of what survives is secondhand, later accounts describing a transsentient civilization that arrived from outside the Milky Way billions of years ago, shaping or seeding the origins of numerous sentient species, including humans and Forerunners. They called their governing idea the Mantle of Responsibility, a duty to guard every form of life they had helped create. Guardianship sounds simple until somebody has to decide who inherits it. The Precursors picked the Forerunners first, handing them the job of caretaker over the entire galaxy. Then they changed their minds and picked humanity instead, and that disputed succession became a foundational grievance in Halo's galactic history. The Forerunners turned on their creators in a conflict whose precise trigger remains disputed, launching the campaign that drove the Precursors to near extinction. And some survivors converted themselves into molecular dust, literally, hoping to regenerate when it was safe. Canon confirms that dust turned corrupted afterward and became tied to the Flood, the parasite that later eats its way through most of this franchise. That means later Flood outbreaks are, in a sense, chewing through material seeded by the same civilization responsible for the food source doing the chewing. The detailed account comes from the Forerunner saga. That dust went defective and developed into an early Flood form, with the finer mechanics beyond that unclear. Take this next part as the strongest available reading. That dust is either what's left of the Precursors themselves, or the raw material something else used to build the Flood from scratch. Long before there's an empire handing out ranks, or a conscript standing in the mud following orders he never agreed to, this fight already decided who gets to matter and who gets spent. The mantle can become a burden when the civilization carrying it decides that guardianship requires absolute control, and absolute control tends to need someone weaker underneath it to test that theory on. Forerunners. An extremely advanced civilization solved a plague by deleting the food chain that fed it. Efficient, if nothing else. Total, immediate, final. That is the whole plan, stripped down to one sentence. 7 rings carried out the deleting. The Forerunners activated them as a coordinated last resort against the Flood, and by then the species pulling the trigger had already stopped thinking of itself as a rescue team. Call them what the record calls them. The Forerunners, heirs to a duty called the Mantle, built as a species for command from top to bottom. Their society divided mature citizens into caste-like rates, including builders, who raised the megastructures, miners, who handled raw materials, life workers, who managed life and biology, warrior servants, who formed the military and defense force, engineers, who kept the machinery breathing, and juridicals, who handled law. Other rates existed in some periods, and juvenile manipulars were left unsorted until maturity. The rest of the species ran like a machine with a soul bolted onto the frame. They started on a world called Gibalb and ran the empire from a capital called Mithrilion, a political center for an ecumene that stretched across roughly 3 million fertile worlds. 3 million worlds, all of it, answering to one seat of government. A single Forerunner could live for thousands of years. Their tech is commonly classified as Tier 1 in Halo reference material, the highest commonly cited technology level in the setting. They built the Halo Array as a last resort weapon against the Flood. 7 ring worlds, fired in 97,145 BCE, designed to kill sentient life within their effective range and cut the Flood off from the hosts it needed. Humans and Forerunners are separate species in current canon, and their shared history was long and hostile. The Forerunner response to the Flood culminated in the Halo Array, and that decision would shape the galaxy inherited by the surviving species. The rings swept through their effective range, killing sentient life complex enough to serve as Flood hosts, human, Forerunner client, or otherwise. The firing reshaped the post-war galaxy. The rings stopped the plague cold, leaving the Flood without the sentient hosts it needed to spread. What moved into that emptiness next is a story of its own, the Flood. Killing you is the least of what the Flood wants. It wants what is inside your skull. Once it takes that, useful memories and knowledge can remain available to the Flood even though the original mind is gone. The infection form does the killing. The knowledge is the harvest. The Forerunners filed it under a catalog number, LFXX373, the kind of label you'd expect on a maintenance report, bureaucracy's answer to an apocalypse. The Covenant called it the parasite, a word that undersells an organism that graduates from biting to thinking in the space of a single outbreak. Flood outbreaks can progress from feral infection to proto-gravemind development, and then coordinated action under a gravemind. Feral flood behave like an infection with legs, spreading through infection forms and combat forms that overwhelm a population through raw numbers and aggression. Feral flood forms seek hosts with enough biomass and cognitive capability to support infection. Coordinated floods start acting through a collective intelligence rather than as wholly independent monsters. The jump between those stages unsettles the biology, because pack behavior with no obvious pack leader has to come from somewhere. That coordination grows out of accumulating flood biomass, as a proto-gravemind develops into the central intelligence called a gravemind. Once a gravemind forms, the Flood can coordinate many infected forms as parts of one compound intelligence, more like fingers on the same hand than a swarm. It directs the Flood the way a mind directs its limbs, retaining information from the hosts it has assimilated. Call it what you like: species, disease, or distributed superorganism, each label catching a different point in its life cycle. That's the framing this video is using, because the biology refuses to sit still long enough for one word to cover it. Nothing in the record settles which label is most accurate, because the Flood keeps changing shape faster than any single category can hold it. That biomass may contain the remains and retained memories of someone who once had a name, maybe a low-ranked Covenant soldier who never chose the front line he died on, but not his intact original mind. Those memories are now processing power inside something that grows more capable as it assimilates more biomass. The weapon built as a last resort against the Flood starts looking less like ambition and more like panic once you realize what it was actually aimed at. A Forerunner relic system designed to affect sentient life on a galaxy-wide scale gives its interpreters a throne, and the throne eventually needs an empire to enforce its meaning. Prophets. The species that convinced an entire empire to worship its interpretation of ancient scripture couldn't keep its own numbers above a rounding error by the time the story ended. Sanshayum is what they call themselves on Janjur-Com. Humans call them prophets, and the title fits better than most translated names do because these are the beings who decided what the Forerunners' leftover technology meant and then sold that meaning as law. The Flood turned shared knowledge into a weapon that could think for itself. The Sanshayum found the same weapon in a simpler form. Control the story of the mantle, and you control everyone who wants to inherit it. In 852 BCE, the Sanshayum and the species that would carry their wars formalized that arrangement in the Writ of Union, trading ancient authority for military muscle they didn't have themselves. It worked. By 2552, the Sanshayum population was reported at 23,131,493, though that figure shouldn't be read as High Charity's headcount alone. A population big enough to run a religion as a government and a government as a fleet. Sacred interpretation carried more weight than muscle ever could. Many mature Sanshayum needed anti-gravity chairs just to get around, while higher-ranking prophets rode shielded anti-gravity thrones through High Charity, directing invasions fought by other species' hands. From here, some Sanshayum numbers and historical accounts become disputed rather than definitive, and part of that uncertainty comes from Sanshayum claims that cannot be independently verified. The surviving lore leaves open how much of that gap is documented history and how much may reflect politically shaped accounts. Sanshayum accounts place the destruction of their homeworld, Janjur-Com, around 648 BCE. Some lore summaries repeat that date with confidence. Others treat it as a detail that may have been altered or used to conceal what actually happened. By Sanshayum's own account, a homeworld was lost centuries before the empire it built reached its peak, and the survivors kept climbing anyway. The climb ended fast. After the Flood invasion of High Charity, the surviving Sanshayum population was estimated at fewer than 1,000, a number small enough to fit in a stadium section. Though that figure says nothing about everyone else who still followed the Covenant faith. Picture the arithmetic. The Sanshayum themselves were counted in roughly 24 million by 2552, a population the Flood invasion of High Charity reduced to fewer than 1,000 soon after. That's the trade a grunt on Balaho never got to negotiate, taking orders from a hierarchy that turned out to be this breakable at the top. Political authority gains reach through the species willing to turn doctrine into battlefield power, elites. Some of the Covenant's most formidable soldiers answered to leaders despite holding enough military power to become indispensable to the Covenant. and that institutional disparity was built into the Covenant's hierarchy. The Covenant depended heavily on Sangheili military authority, while the Prophets retained political and religious control, a balance maintained through tradition, hierarchy, and prophet manipulation until it broke during the Great Schism. The Sangheili call themselves exactly that, Sangheili, and human contact is what supplied the name elite for the species. Sanghelios is their homeworld, a place we barely see and mostly hear about through the warriors it sent to fronts across the war. Sangheili are a saurian species with a characteristic four-mandible jaw and a physique built for their reputation as formidable warriors. Mandibles that look built to end an argument before it starts. Sangheili culture runs on honor, combat, and lineage, codified into a warrior tradition strict enough to dictate how you fight, who you fight, and what happens to your name and your family's name if you fight badly. They formed the Covenant's military backbone and maintained a powerful warrior tradition, the founding species standing beside the Prophets when the Empire first formed, and establishing the Covenant's original division between Prophet rule and Sangheili military authority. Sangheili traditionally supplied much of the Covenant's military leadership, although the Covenant also fielded other species and later placed some fleets under Jiralhanae command. Covenant honor guardsmen were traditionally Sangheili, standing close enough to end a prophet's throne in seconds if the mood ever turned, until Jiralhanae replaced them shortly before the Great Schism. Political and religious authority stayed with the prophets, while Sangheili commands sat over a hierarchy that included several other species. The historical record clearly documents a strong Sangheili honor-based warrior culture. Call the same code a leash the prophets tightened on purpose, and you're one step past the documented culture into a read worth taking seriously anyway. The Covenant's hierarchy made Sangheili honor, rank, and military service useful to prophet rule, and the prophets manipulated those institutions when it served their interests. That arrangement could obscure how much prophet authority depended on the Sangheili who actually carried the Covenant's military power. An Ungoi from Bellaho, a homeworld with an actual name, is handed a plasma pistol and placed near the bottom of the Covenant's hierarchy, while the Sangheili, standing above him, supplied much of the Covenant's military power within a system of honor, religion, hierarchy, and political control, and eventually rebelled during the Great Schism. When an empire ranks lives by usefulness, its cheapest soldiers reveal the system's true price. Grunts. The Covenant's comic relief soldiers once forced the Empire to burn part of their own homeworld. Humans call them grunts. They call themselves Ungoi, and back on Bellaho, the methane-thick world they evolved on, breathing normal air would kill them just as fast as a plasma bolt to the chest. Ungoi soldiers use methane equipment when they operate outside a methane-rich atmosphere, hauling their breathing supply into someone else's war. That tank is the joke's missing punchline. An Ungoi moving through a human corridor is carrying a tiny weather system on his back. The equipment keeps methane flowing around his face, turning ordinary movement through Covenant territory into a maintenance problem before the shooting even starts. The silhouette looks ridiculous until you remember it represents somebody's ability to breathe. Great, that's a very specific kind of expendable. The Covenant incorporated the Ungoi in 2142. Sangheili gave the orders. Ungoi handled the most disposable jobs in the war machine, sent to the front line as expendable numbers at the bottom of the Covenant hierarchy. Fans still dispute exactly where that incorporation lands in the Covenant's succession order, with two counting methods placing the Ungoi as either the 6th or 7th client species, depending on whether the founding species make the list. The rank itself stays constant, the lowest social and military standing in the Empire, reserved for laborers and expendable troops on battlefields they did not control. That social rank reached beyond battlefield assignments. Ungoi were treated as subjugated labor, and the Covenant leaned on their numbers to fill the most expendable jobs in its war machine. A worker breathing through a tank can still be ordered into combat, which is a grim definition of career development. Labor, subordination, and expendable deployment define survival under somebody else's command. Eventually, they stopped absorbing it. The Ungoi launched a major open rebellion against the Covenant in 2462, after centuries of incorporation and abuse. The species usually presented as disposable background noise had organized enough resistance that the revolt spread through High Charity itself, the Empire's own seat of power. The Covenant suppressed the rebellion, and an arbiter ordered the partial glassing of Bellaho. Bellaho took glassing damage, partially scorched by a Covenant fleet during the rebellion's suppression, after centuries of Covenant rule that had treated Ungoi as disposable labor and expendable troops. Picture one conscript standing in his methane rig, watching the sky over his homeworld turn to fire, punished by the Empire he'd bled for since birth, breathing borrowed air while his own planet burned under him. Sangheili Strength built the Covenant's war machine, and Balaho is the receipt for who actually covers the cost when that machine turns inward on the people who fueled it. When survival inside an empire depends on profitable violence, the next rung belongs to specialists who turn the empire's rules into a personal business. Jackals. The Covenant sometimes destroyed or subjugated civilizations and species that resisted its religious and political order, and somewhere inside that same empire, a ministry sat down and drew up paperwork for pirates. That paperwork belonged to a species. Humans usually call them jackals, while the species' own name is Kig-Yar. The Kig-Yar's covenant arrangement was unusually practical. They entered service through commissions for privateering. The Kig-Yar got a contract. The Covenant found them in the Wideo system and folded them into the Empire in 1342, one entry in a long list of Covenant accessions. The Kig-Yar accepted the arrangement while preserving a profitable privateering role. Rather than placing them at the center of its priesthoods and warrior castes, the Covenant incorporated the Kig-Yar as low-status privateers and mercenaries, with profit helping make the arrangement attractive to a species already driven by personal desire and need. The Ministry of Tranquility issued them commissions and letters of marque, imperial paperwork, that turned raiding into a sanctioned trade. A Kig-Yar crew carrying those documents could raid targets under Covenant authority. The empire that could unleash extreme violence against those it branded enemies of its faith handed another species a license to steal, on the condition the theft served the war effort, a holy war with a receipts drawer for stolen cargo. Efficient, if nothing else. It read less like doctrine and more like inventory management with a war attached. Piracy remained part of Kig-Yar culture even after the ink dried. Old habits, it turns out, make excellent job security. Kig-Yar privateering gave them sanctioned opportunities for plunder and salvage, allowing some of their piratical practices to continue under Covenant authority. Many jackals carry a portable energy shield on one arm, equipment commonly associated with the Kig-Yar. The point defense gauntlet gives Kig-Yar raiders an arm-held shield that can block enemy fire as they angle their wrist. The Kig-Yar include multiple subspecies, including the Tavauans, who are often called skirmishers by humans. Ruchans are the common Kig-Yar associated with the jackal designation, while Tavauans are a Kig-Yar subspecies often called skirmishers, and distinguished by a larger, more muscular build. The label skirmisher can also describe a combat role shared more broadly among Kig-Yar. Several subgroup details stay open to interpretation, but the pattern holds anyway. The Kig-Yar are one species with multiple subspecies and combat roles, including Tavauan skirmishers and the more familiar jackals. Compare that arrangement to the conscript from Balaho, handed a plasma pistol and a rank nobody respects. The Ungoi of Balaho served as low-status infantry in the Covenant war machine. The Kig-Yar negotiated a price for their loyalty. That bargain differed from the arrangements imposed on some other Covenant species. Piracy turned out to be the easy version of service. The battlefield had other specialized Covenant formations waiting, including units built from multiple organisms working as one weapon. Hunters. A hunter walks onto the battlefield like a single 7-foot monster wrapped in orange armor plating, and that image is the least accurate part of the whole encounter. Crack that armor open, and you find many individual worm-like organisms called Lekgolo, packed together and operating as one mind, one body, one gun. The thing shooting at you is a committee with a cannon. Lekgolo originate from Te, a harsh world whose orbital rings include the remains of a forerunner construct the species destroyed and consumed over time. Lekgolo colonies inhabited those orbital rings, adapted to conditions most soldiers facing down a hunter in the middle of a firefight probably don't have the spare second to appreciate. Individually, the worms are small and far less effective than a coordinated gestalt, easy to miss next to the towering colony they eventually make up. Braided together into a Lekgolo colony, though, they generate the raw strength to punch straight through armor plating, the coordination to move like a single trained soldier, and a kind of intelligence built from thousands of smaller minds all voting in real time. The Covenant didn't inherit that firepower for free. Beginning in 789 BCE, the Covenant fought the conflict now called the Taming of the Lekgolo, 5 years of fighting that ended with the species' incorporation in 784 BCE. They fought across Te's colonies, incorporating some and targeting destructive colonies for eradication. A colony that preserved Forerunner relics got folded into the Empire as a weapon, while colonies that consumed or destroyed those relics faced eradication. How each colony treated the old Forerunner machinery helped decide whether it was incorporated or targeted for eradication. It's the same appetite the Kig-Yar answered with a price list, except this time the currency was survival itself, priced out at the level of biology rather than rating rights, one more debt collected in the Covenant's long ledger of tame species. In Halo terminology, Legolo names the worm-like species, while Megalic Golo names the gestalt form commonly called a hunter. The distinction matters because Legolo can form multiple kinds of collectives, and the armored combat form is only the one you keep meeting while it tries to turn your afternoon into a workplace accident. Canon leaves the exact number of individual Legolo in a given suit unresolved. Fan calculations about hunter worm counts exist, but they are not canon measurements. What holds up is the shape of the trait itself, a species whose fate was decided by how its colonies treated someone else's Forerunner technology, then wired straight into Covenant ranks as heavily armed Covenant ground troops. Somewhere below that armor stands an Ungoi holding a plasma pistol. He was never given a choice about carrying, watching two worm colonies in matching plate march past him toward the front line, already smaller than either one before the fight even starts, and probably grateful for it. A living community can carry a cannon into battle, and the Covenant put that same collective strength to work as heavily armed ground troops. Brutes. The Covenant turned survivors of a recent nuclear civil war into powerful enforcers, and their homeworld bore the damage until Cortana destroyed Doisac in 2559. Nuclear war devastated Doisac shortly before the Covenant incorporated the Jiralhanae in 2492 and put them to work in its military. Afterward, the Jiralhanae adopted or inherited Covenant technology, while their post-war society was still only rediscovering radio and rocketry. Much of their advanced hardware came from that Covenant equipment, but Jiralhanae designs and research hadn't disappeared, and their engineers went on to combine native technology with Covenant gear. Officially, the story is simple, almost clean. The Jiralhanae, known to humans as brutes, joined the Covenant as new allies, prized for raw physical power and given a place among the Empire's warrior castes. Native to Doisac, they're heavily built, carnivorous, ape-like in some accounts and pseudo-ursine in others, built with the kind of mass and muscle that makes a boarding action look like a formality, and a doorway look like an inconvenience. That size and strength made them formidable additions to the Covenant military. Jiralhanae society already ran on a warlike culture before the Covenant ever arrived, which made their later role as enforcers feel like a natural fit for the Empire. The part left out of the recruitment story is what happened right before it. A civil conflict on Doisac, remembered as the Great Immolation, dragged on for roughly a decade and escalated past conventional weapons into full nuclear war. Cities burned, populations collapsed. The species that would go on to serve as the Covenant's shock troops had recently devastated its own civilization in an internal nuclear war. The Covenant used Ungoi as low status, expendable infantry, and deployed Megalic Golo colonies as armored shock troops and guards. The Great Immolation was an internal nuclear war that devastated Jiralhanae civilization, and their physical strength and warrior reputation still made them useful as enforcement muscle for an empire that had no use for diplomats or therapists. Somewhere below them, in the ranks, an Ungoi conscript watches this promotion happen in real time and understands, better than anyone in the entire hierarchy, exactly what it looks like when a species gets valued for how expendable it is rather than what it actually wants. The timing is the detail worth sitting with. Brute influence rose right as Sangheili authority within the Covenant started to strain, and the Prophets had every reason to want a counterweight to warriors they no longer fully trusted. Nothing in Covenant record states outright that Jiralhanae promotion was engineered specifically to weaken the elites, but the pattern fits together too neatly to wave off. Canon supports the Jiralhanae's usefulness against the Sangheili, militarily and politically, but whether their rise was mainly combat necessity or a calculated demotion dressed up as a promotion remains an open question. A hierarchy that treated Ungoi as expendable infantry and deployed Megalic Golo colonies as armored shock troops had already shown it would assign entire species to highly instrumental military roles. Handing the Sangheili a rival built from a civilization that had already detonated itself checks out as exactly the kind of move that Empire had shown itself willing to make. A force used against rival warriors creates its own new problem. Next come the drones, the Yanmei drones. The name drone is an insult dressed up as a description. It promises you nothing worth remembering, just an insect that dies and gets replaced by an identical insect 5 seconds later. Yanmei society runs on a hive structure organized around established castes that serve a reproductive queen, with workers and protectors handling different functions. Efficient, if a little grim, if you're the one born into the worker line. That's the part the battlefield nickname erases completely. The humans who slapped drone on these things were looking at soldiers buzzing through a firefight, not at the queen running the operation back home on Palamok. Palamoc is where the species actually comes from, and it's where the caste system that defines them evolved long before the Covenant ever showed up. The Covenant first made contact with the Yanmei in 1112, during one of its long searches for Forerunner artifacts. The Covenant's first move after that encounter was handing the Yanmei mops and cleaning schedules. Rifles came later, once someone worked out what the hive was actually capable of. The Covenant stumbled onto an entire caste-based hive economy, complete with a queen, reproductive males, and dedicated worker and soldier lines built for different jobs. Soldiers came after custodians for a reason. A eusocial species that already sorts its own population into disposable and non-disposable roles is exactly the kind of workforce a hierarchy like the Covenant's is built to plug straight into a war machine. Queens reproduce. Males exist specifically to reproduce with them. Workers keep the hive running. Soldiers exist to die protecting all of it. Which sounds bleak until you remember that's the entire evolutionary point of a soldier caste, and the Yanmei built that system long before anyone handed them a nickname. The questions worth asking got skipped along the way. Nothing in the Covenant's chain of command suggests anyone stopped to ask what a Yanmei queen actually wanted, or whether soldier counted as an upgrade from custodian when both jobs end the same way. The caste system gave the hive stability for generations on Palamoc. It also gave the Covenant a labor pool that never needed convincing, just assignment. So the next time somebody calls them just drones, picture the queen they never see, running a society with its own internal logic long before the first Yanmei ever picked up a weapon. The insult was about how little effort anyone put into learning what was underneath the wings, not about the bug doing the flying. The Covenant built its entire military around species it barely bothered to understand, and understanding was never really the requirement for making something useful. Engineers. A Huragok can interface with ancient Forerunner technology and repair or enhance it, often with a mastery that looks less like maintenance and more like invention. That is the terrifying part. This is a being designed to understand machinery so completely that repair and innovation become the same motion, a job description with zero union protections. The Forerunners built the Huragok before the Halo array ever fired, using artificial nanocellular technology to create biomechanical maintenance beings whose abilities the Covenant only partially understood. Their formal designation is factitious indoles, commonly translated as artificial genius, manufactured minds in biomechanical bodies that mimic living systems. Call them a species, and you are half right. Call them a supercomputer with tentacles, and you are also half right. The truth sits in the gap between those two descriptions, and that gap is where the tragedy lives. Huragok are sentient. They form attachments, they solve problems creatively, they show something close to personality across the games and books that feature them. They are artificial sentient beings, primarily built to maintain, repair, and enhance Forerunner technology across ages of history. Their bodies make the case even stranger. A Huragok floats through corridors on internal gas bladders and works several problems at once, with enough manipulator tentacles to open 6 panels in the time a human engineer opens one. It communicates through specialized gestures and other nonverbal signals, with limited vocalization that other species often struggle to understand. It reproduces through a process that is more mechanical than biological, gathering materials and using its cilia to build a new Huragok that then develops independently. The Covenant found that purpose useful, and they folded it into an empire that already treated the Yanmei as disposable labor. Huragok became technicians. They maintained Covenant technology and ships as non-combatant specialists, although some Huragok were later fitted with explosive charges. The Covenant relied on Huragok as technical specialists to maintain the ships and systems the Empire depended on. Then the Covenant found a second use. Some Huragok were fitted with volatile payloads and sent into enemy positions as walking bombs. A being built to preserve and advance technology was sometimes fitted with explosive charges and used as a suicide weapon. The same species valued for important technical work under the Covenant was also turned into a weapon. Whatever survives is useful. Whatever explodes is also useful, and nobody asks the tool what it wants. That is the quiet horror sitting underneath the engineers. The Forerunners built a living archive of their own genius, something capable of carrying their technological legacy forward on its own initiative. The Covenant looked at that inheritance and saw 2 categories: parts to fix and charges to detonate. Across these examples, the same pattern keeps repeating. Beings valued as resources can also be turned into weapons. The Yanmei get treated as replaceable labor. The Ungoi get sent to the front lines in numbers that make their expendability impossible to miss. Now a being smart enough to improve Forerunner engineering gets strapped with explosives and pointed at a door. The mantle these empires claim to protect keeps landing on the same beings twice, once as a resource and once as a weapon. Somewhere in this galaxy sits a population that outlasted the one weapon built to end all of it. And figuring out how they managed that means finally asking what the Halo Array's promise of control was actually worth: the Endless. The Forerunners built a weapon that erased almost every thinking mind in the galaxy, and one species kept breathing through it anyway. They lived through an event engineered to leave nothing standing, and the Empire that pulled the trigger had no explanation for how they managed it. Every claim the Forerunners made about the mantle of responsibility, every argument about who gets to decide which species lives, runs straight into this one exception they never solved. So what do you do with a species you still can't explain? The species is known as the Xalanin, while the Forerunners called them the Endless. The Halo Array fired across the galaxy, and when the dust settled, the Forerunners found the Xalanin alive despite the weapon's effects. They imprisoned the survivors on Installation 07 for containment and study. You know it as Zeta Halo, and you've already walked its corridors without knowing what they were built to hold, back before anyone explained why. The Hur'gok get handed tools and a compulsion to fix them, servitude wired straight into their own instincts. The Xalanin got something heavier, a containment complex sealed specifically to hold beings that survived the Forerunners' galaxy cleansing weapon. The Silent Auditorium was the Forerunners' courtroom and prisons on Installation 07, where they judged the Endless and sentenced them to indefinite imprisonment. They contained and studied a species they still did not fully understand. That's a structural confession poured into concrete and coded into a security system. The Forerunners claimed authority over life in the galaxy, then built the Halo Array to eradicate the Flood's sentient food source. The Xalanin survived its firing, and the reason remains unexplained. In Halo Infinite, the Harbinger is released from a Silex on Zeta Halo and seeks to free the remaining Endless, roughly 100,000 years after their imprisonment on the Ring. The war on Zeta Halo runs on top of Cortana's ambition and the Banished tearing through Forerunner ruins, and underneath both of them sits a jailbreak. The galaxy has been circling without naming it for longer than anyone realized. The mechanism behind that survival stays an open question, and it deserves honesty instead of a tidy answer. Possible explanations include a biological property, unknown technology, or a condition tied to Installation 07, but canon has not confirmed any of them. Nothing in the current record settles which explanation is right. Claims that the Xalanin also carry immunity to the Flood follow a shakier path still, a guess stretched from surviving one extinction event to assuming they'd survive a second, and no canon source cited here confirms that stretch. What's confirmed is simpler and heavier, and it's the same weight the whole chain of this galaxy's power has carried from the start, from the highest throne down to the lowest conscript. Sanshayum built a faith on Forerunner promises. Sangheli enforced that faith with fleets. An Ungoi conscript gets handed a plasma pistol and a rank nobody respects. Cannon fodder and a helmet 2 sizes too big, because the Covenant decided his species mattered less than the mission it served. The Forerunners ran that same math across an entire galaxy, deciding which lives were worth preserving. They built the Halo Array to deny the Flood its sentient food source by destroying sentient life, and the Xalanin survived the firing anyway. They are the one-line item in that ledger that never balanced. The Halo Array ended an age and left the Xalanin breathing inside a prison built to explain why. If you enjoyed this video and want to see more, click the video on the screen now